I have a very serious question for you. Have you ever imagined what human meat tastes like? And what's the standard for the most perverse behavior in the world about getting along with someone else? Is it that taking the body, torture with brutal means, processing food from the raw materials of the meat of our fellow men is the end of the crime? Today, we're going to explore the horrendous case of the killer and carnivorous Albert Fish, the demon in human garments, the embodiment of crime and inhuman cruelty. The intensive 6-year criminal investigation of the police force has caused many people to want to forget the case. But any crime has to come to light, and today's case will surely make a lot of people shudder. You're following the Albert Fish case on our channel, and as usual, before listening to the main content, don't forget to leave a like, click on the follow-up channel and turn on the notification bell to update the most impressive cases. It was on a Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, that Albert came to my brother's house at 406 West Street. He's bringing strawberries, formatting, and having lunch at your house. Right now, the owner's daughter, Grace, approaches him, and immediately he makes an intention to take Grace. After the meal, he asked for permission to take Grace to the party, but it was essentially to accomplish a plan. He took Grace to an abandoned house in Winchester City and told her to stand outside. He entered the house, wiped out his body, and went into the wardrobe waiting for Grace. When the girl walked in and saw him in a state of impeccable cloth covering the body, screamed out of fear. Fearing that Grace would tell her parents about this, he chased after Grace and shoved her neck until she stopped breathing. Then Albert's mind is no longer human. He literally turns the girl into his food. It took him 3 days to eat all the remains of Grace. William King was one of the investigators who followed the case from the outset. In the early 20th century, it was known that kidnapping was mainly aimed at the children of wealthy families and then demanded a ransom. But in Grace's case, the kidnapper didn't ask for anything. More ridiculously, he didn't even waste any energy on breaking up, rushing into the family's house and leaving with Grace with her parents' permission. The man who pretended to be a rich farmer was looking for a guy to run the farm. The first time I entered Grace's house was on May 28, 1928. At 3:30 p.m. Albert introduces himself to Frank Howard, who needed to hire a farmer. He knew Edward, the landlord's son, because Edward had posted a job search. On June 3rd, he returned to the host family at 11 a.m. to ask Edward for permission and would take Grace to the party by evening. He could easily get his family's approval, but no one knew it was the last time they saw his daughter. Back in the case, during exploration and investigation, William discovered a small hexagonal symbol of the letters NPCBA on the envelope containing the letter that Albert left behind. This abbreviation refers to the New York Private Driver Charity, which has its address at 627 Lexington Avenue. Police officer William arrived at the scene and confirmed the 400 handwritings of each member of the association and found a clue to the suspect's residence address. William goes to the hotel at 200 East Street on Avenue 52, meets the landlord and explains that he's looking for a man named Frank Howard, usually wearing a vest, about 60 years old, gray-haired, scarfed. Frida Schneider's owner replied that no, there was no Frank Howard here, but there was a man quite similar to the description of the cop named Albert Fish, sleeping upstairs, but he wasn't at home today. So Frida promised to call William when he came back. On December 13th, the owner of the newspaper, William, said that Albert was at the hostel. Immediately, the police came to verify. When he saw William, Albert proceeded by pulling a small knife out of his pocket. Through his expertise, the police quickly got him under control and the whole truth was stopped right in the detention room. Albert was supposed to kidnap Edward, the host family's son, but with his 2-foot body, he was afraid Edward would rebel out of control, affecting his plans. So he quickly switched his target to Grace, and to carry out the plan, he prepared a knife and a pile in a paper box. With the consent of Grace's parents, he went to the train station to buy a ticket to Winchester County, which takes 40 minutes. When he arrived in Winchester, he continued to take Grace through the deserted streets, and eventually he stopped at the desolate house called Wisteria Cottage, lying in the middle of the forest surrounded by the forest. And whatever happens, Grace's throat is pushed by him to stop breathing. Without stopping, he didn't even hate to destroy the bad girl's body. 3 days after the murder, Albert returns to bury Grace in a stone wall at Wisteria Cottage. Albert, the perpetrator, was 63 at the time. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington. His father, Randall Fish, was a Marines and was retrained to be a fertilizer producer. When Albert was born, he was 70 years old, and 5 years later, he died of ill health. Albert's mother, 23 years old, is a housewife and has 4 children. When Albert was 5 years old, his mother had to send him to an orphanage because of his inadequate capacity and ability to take care of his 4 children. For 5 years in the orphanage, Albert was physically harassed. He's constantly being mocked, tortured, but he doesn't show weakness. On the contrary, he seems to be quite interested in the children's jokes in it. By the age of 9, Albert's mother picked him up from the kindergarten because she had now found a more stable job. After returning home to reunite with his mother and brothers, Albert was very interested in the stories that his second brother was telling. It's like robbing and brutally killing people. His brother often showed him pictures of beautiful girls, but Albert didn't seem interested. Every night, he thinks and dreams about dealing with a bunch of people and turning the victims into his food. When Albert was 12 years old, he began to show strange hobbies. By the age of 15 to 16, Albert went to the public bathroom, or rather to the dressing room, to watch the other boys take their clothes off. At the age of 17, he found his first job as a painter. In a perfect envelope, he frequently goes to paint and redecorate the old buildings that are poorly decorated in the area. He volunteered at orphanages and schools to find a target. His first victims, when he was about 20 to 25, were black children from poor families. At that time, racism was going strong in the United States. That's why he's targeting this audience, because nobody cares about their appearance. Usually, Albert seduces the victims with sweet candy or cute dogs and locks them in deserted houses in the woods. The acts he usually performed were brutal beating, starving until the victim died. In 1894, Albert went to New York to marry and have children. His wife was Anna Mary, and his 6 children were Albert Jr., Anna, Katie, Eugene, John, and Henry. In 1903, his mother died, and that same year he was sentenced to 16 months in prison for obscenity after stealing money from the computer of the grocery store where he worked. In 1911, Albert met Thomas Bedden, a 19-year-old homeless man with a mental disorder. Immediately, he rented a private room and took Thomas in. First, he shaved his head because this young man's head was full of lice. Albert was 41 at the time, and he was about to spend 3 weeks with Thomas. Albert begged Thomas to be happy about him, and within the next 3 weeks, Albert tortured Thomas with all sorts of wounds on his body. After being satisfied, he gave Thomas $10 and let the boy go. During the torture of Thomas, Albert didn't come home or contact his wife. On January 19, 1917, after 19 years of living together and having 6 children, Anna Mary decided to leave her home. However, only 3 months later, she came back and begged Albert forgiveness because her new lover was violent. She couldn't live with that violence. Albert agreed to Anna's return home, and he discovered the shocking fact that his wife and his lover were living in his family's own house. An outbreak of rage occurred. Everything in the house collapsed. Soon after his marriage, Albert's mental state was declining. He's alone. To relieve the pressure, Albert regularly punches himself in front of the girls. He's still punishing himself with a stick in the back, freeing himself from all sins. As time passed, each of his children had to leave him after discovering an abnormality from his father. Because of his loneliness, Albert tried to kidnap an 8-year-old girl on July 11, 1924. In the Bronx neighborhood of Staten Island, Beatrice Keel was playing alone in her parents' farm, and Albert approached her. He gave me money in exchange for a short walk with her. But fortunately, your mother saw you leave with the man she later described as an elderly gray-haired gentleman. Albert even went back to sleep in the warehouse that night and was kicked out by Beatrice's parents. 3 days after the incident, an 8-year-old boy named Francis McDonald was approached by an elderly man with a shaved hair in a beautiful vest. It's evening and Francis is playing soccer in the public park with a couple of friends. Noting the boy's disappearance a few minutes later, Francis' friends started searching and calling his name, but there was no answer. Francis' father was a police officer, so a search by the operative force took place quickly. The last person who saw Francis was his neighbor George Stern around 4:30 p.m. This man saw the child passing through his house with an old man, as if he was leading the boy down a remote road running through the woods. 3 detectives, Henry Lano, Thomas Perrin, and Henry Wood, quickly discovered Francis McDonald's body trapped in the woods in a state of clothing. His hat was torn apart, brutally tortured to deformation before he could not survive. Francis' father asked to join the investigation team. However, at that time there were no security cameras in every corner as there are nowadays, and there was no trace of the police continuing to keep an eye on the case and time passing. The departure of an 8-year-old kid has gone into oblivion. 2.5 years after the murder of Francis McDonald, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney continues to be the victim of the man described as in gray. At the end of February 11, 1927, Billy, a thin 4-year-old, was playing on the first floor with a weak flashlight with his 3-year-old neighbor's son and Johnny, 12. When Albert appeared to seduce the two children, Johnny ran upstairs to bed his sleeping sister. Back on the first floor, 2 boys, Billy and his brother, disappeared. The 3-year-old boy's grandfather ran around looking but didn't find anything unusual. And of course, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds can't go far in a short span of just a few dozen minutes. Immediately, the boy's grandfather realized that his grandson was being kidnapped. The boy's grandfather followed the sound on the roof and found his nephew there. The boy describes a man with blooming hair, with a long beard and a gray suit who took himself upstairs looking at the smoke pipe, watching the steamboat with Billy. Then Billy followed him. However, no one believed the boy's words. The police also suggested that the 3-year-old boy was talking nonsense and Billy was probably walking alone and he'd be back soon. The logic of the force at the time was that if someone kidnapped a child, they would surely choose a wealthy family to demand a ransom. A wide-ranging search was carried out by Billy's neighbors across the river, the canal near the Billy house, but the boy was not found. This is why, at the time, mass kidnappers targeted minorities or the poor. Because nobody cares if they disappear or not, and in most cases they're self-evacuated by default. At the time, Albert was working as a painter at a real estate company in Brooklyn, and on the day Billy Gaffney disappeared, he was working just a few miles from where the boy was kidnapped. A tram driver, Anthony Barone, saw Billy on the day the boy disappeared at about 7 p.m. along with an old man in a gray jersey. The man seemed anxious and asked how to get to Staten Island, and then he got on the ferry. He's Albert. Billy's body was later found in a box in an abandoned house on the streets of New York. Everyone who witnessed the discovery felt terrible, chicken-skinned by Albert's inhuman behavior. Each piece of Billy was put in each bag, and then he mourned by throwing those bags into the dirt on the way to North Beach. The rest he brought home and made in the oven with some onions and sauce. That way, the meal will be better and sweeter than the roasted chicken. It can't be as delicious as a meal he's made with his own hands. It wasn't until police officer William started an investigation into Grace Budd's kidnapping and disappearance that the truth was brought to light. It turns out the devil still exists in the middle of the day in the American country. Albert is the murderer who carried out many brutal acts that the government has never stopped worrying about for decades. Until 1934, Albert was arrested by William and charged with deliberate murder. The press went up at a speed of dizziness, and the last person who killed Grace was finally arrested. Immediately, many parents spoke of their suspicion of Albert. He's a real dishuman. The former owner of the apartment, Helen, refused to allow Albert to continue to rent the house, and in revenge for her, he repeatedly wrote blasphemous letters at your doorstep. The day he moved out, he dumped the garbage all over the room so the landlord had to clean it up. Ms. Laff also alleged that Albert tried to seduce her daughter with candy just 2 months before he was arrested. The most frightening thing is that there's a witness who says he's been catching Albert with his suspicious behavior since July 1924. That was when Albert was 16. By the time he was arrested, Albert was 63 years old. So, it's impossible to know exactly how many victims he's dealt with. At the time of the early 20th century, the internet was not yet developed, the technology was roughly outdated. So if you want to investigate, you have to reach out to every neighbor of Albert from his youth until now. A brief investigation during Albert's painting career at apartments, schools, orphanages identified 15 victims. According to a psychiatrist's prediction, during Albert's lifetime, he may have dealt with at least 100 victims with distorted thinking and loss of his humanity. After his arrest, he showed many manifestations of psychological instability during his time in prison. Several times he punched the needles in his body to torture himself. Another time, he used a sharp chicken bone in the prison to put it on his chest. With his heavenly crimes, only one of his 6 sons agreed to stand up against his father, and the other 5, Albert was very harmonious and regularly wrote letters of interrogation and exchange. Albert Jr., his son, tells us all about Albert's behavior. On the nights of the full moon, Albert will pretend to be deformed and will surely eat a piece of a live steak to ease his bloodthirst. Other times, in his sleep, he would shout grace. On the contrary, the rest of his children were crying for their father in court. At the same time, the 3 psychiatrists also defended Albert for claiming that he had a mental disorder, unable to adjust his behavior. Eventually, the balance of justice is on the victim's side. Albert was sentenced to death by electric chair. Per when he committed the crime, he didn't even think of the scenario of becoming America's leading criminal with unprecedented inhumanity in history, who was later recorded in books describing crimes that the world could not tolerate. On January 16, 1936, Albert, 65, was executed on the electric chair at Sing Sing prison at 11:06 p.m. And to this day, no one knows exactly how many victims Albert has made in his lifetime. What do you think of this shock? Is that what the exact number of Albert's victims is, and do you believe he really dares to eat the same kind of meat? Share your thoughts under the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel to encourage our spirit. There's a lot of classic cases in the world that we're going to cover in our next videos. And now, hello and see you again.